Imagine an electric railroad that once stretched over 180 miles from Oakland to Chico, California. That would be this Sacramento Northern that ended in a tiny yard in a cramped residential area. This is one topic of our much longer Electric Rails Around the Bay DVD production.
We moved to Contra Costa County in the 50s and find an electric railway operation that survived due to a weakness of its parent company, the Western Pacific. This train has passed through Moraga and Valley Vista. Soon, spots on the map such as Pinehurst and Canyon would be passed on the way to Eastport, where a 3,200-foot-long tunnel pierced the Contra Costa and Alameda County border. The train has followed the San Leandro Creek into a narrowing canyon that has seen little development since it has always been watershed territory. On the other side of the tunnel was Shepherd Canyon, the communities of Montclair, Rockridge, and finally Oakland itself. Electric trains ran through the Oakland Hills from 1913 to the end in 1957. This is the south end of a 185-mile-long Sacramento Northern Railway. The Sacramento Northern, or SN, ran a passenger service until mid-1941. After that, they concentrated on a growing freight business. The parent of Sacramento Northern was the Western Pacific, shown in orange. The yellow line was built by the Oakland and Antioch to tap into the population of Contra Costa County and its agriculture. The related Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern built the line north of Suisun Bay to Sacramento, the capital of California. The Northern Electric Railway was built from Sacramento to Marysville, Yuba City, Oroville, and finally Chico. This became the north end of the Sacramento Northern, when all these lines from Oakland up to Chico were consolidated in 1929. The SN became an important feeder line of the Western Pacific. The north end always had its own look and heritage. One important branch line was the Colusa branch, shown here. This presentation will concentrate on the south end of the Sacramento Northern, and we'll start our tour from Oakland, California. Long electric trains with parlor cars and dining facilities once ran up Shafter Avenue in early Oakland days, linking travelers to points north in style and speed. If you wanted to ride to Walnut Creek, Concord, or even Sacramento, this was a fast, convenient, and scenic way to do it. The equipment was the best available, and the south end featured modern block signaling for safety. Finding a direct way into Oakland placed the line down a residential street that crossed busy College Avenue. These were big, heavy interurban cars that operated trains to steam road standards. Scraping a fender or two and the panic of many near misses didn't make many friends along Shafter Avenue. The residents along this line never cared much for the tracks near their front yards and the accompanying noise. This is Train 17, a local from Concord, nearing the Oakland stop at the 40th and Shafter station. In spite of the local residents' feelings, the SN had many supporters and fans that ran excursions long after the end of regular passenger service. Number 1005 was the belle of the ball on many special runs over SN and key system tracks during the 50s. In the early days, the small yard in Oakland was home to a great variety of passenger and freight equipment. The 1003 class had members up to 1018, and Holman, Wasson, and Cincinnati Car Company built these units before World War I. This crowded scene shows Wasson built 1014, a Niles-built car, and a Hall Scott number 1022, all spilling out onto 40th Street from the cramped yard area. This wood-bodied freight motor, parked at 40th and Shafter, was under lease to the Oakland Terminal Railway until increased freight business required heavier power. The Oakland terminal ran freight trains down Key System's Piedmont Sea Line. You can see the Sacramento Northern facility in the background as a Key System train heads for San Francisco down 40th Street. This diagram of the Key System's 40th Street Sea Line shows the Sacramento Northern station and yard area crammed into a 1.5 square block area. When the SN ran passenger trains, it had trackage rights down the Key System's sea line to the pier and ferry boats. By 1939, the SN trains used the Bay Bridge to carry its passengers to the San Francisco terminal. SN trains came down from the Oakland Hills to the 40th and Shafter station under 1500-volt power and changed over to the Key System's 600-volt power to use the sea line on the way to the Bay Bridge. SN freight trains were handed over to the Oakland Terminal Railway. The Western Pacific and Santa Fe bought the Oakland Terminal, owned by the Key System, in 1943 as a freight connection into the Oakland Army Base. The Key System tracks crossed under the Southern Pacific tracks, shown in red. This Baldwin Westinghouse unit was one of 2 that was leased for this freight connection between the SN and the OT. The OT would typically pick up trains from the westbound SN trains using leased number 440 and 442 electric locomotives. The olive drab flat car load guarantees that the crew will make a trip to the Oakland Army Base. Some of the other loads would be dropped off at various industries in Oakland's manufacturing district. While the OT handled the freight transfers, the SN's passenger trains had trackage rights to use the subway under SP tracks to head west to the Bay Bridge. The west and eastbound tracks split up at the bridge yard. This is the westbound track. An SN train runs east under the SP tracks. Down the line are some Key System shops to the right, and the Santa Fe's terminal was to the left. This westbound has a Wasson built on the point, followed by a Hall Scott and 2 former Northern Electric arch-windowed Niles cars. An SN combination with trailer is on the San Francisco Loop. Inside the terminal, passengers will hop off and take the ramp down to ground level and catch waiting San Francisco municipal streetcars to their final destinations. The train will then gather up eastbound passengers and head back out on the loop to recross the bay on the bridge. Due to declining ridership, the SN couldn't wait to abandon the passenger business and concentrate on freight. Freight traffic was up during the Second World War, and after a lull, it climbed again during the Korean War. Eliminating the passenger traffic in 1941 helped relieve some of the crowding at the cramped and somewhat run-down SN Oakland Yard. The SN was now a freight feeder of the Western Pacific. The parent WP had no easy way to reach the Oakland Army Base and many other customers in Oakland. Transferring loads at Sacramento to SN trains solved this inconvenience. As 661 heads out to assemble a morning eastbound on Shafter Avenue, we see in the background a small railfan crowd beginning to board number 1005 for a fan trip. Several passenger units were used for business and occasional railfan excursion trains until the end. Parked in the 40th and Shafter Yard is a portion of the mainline locomotive roster, 3 GE-built units and a Baldwin Westinghouse. These were all part of the Northern Electric before the merger. Most of the SN's fleet was dual voltage capable, since the north end ran on 600 volts DC. The yard here was energized at 600 volts to allow the Oakland terminal trains to work the area. Most of the SN's power had a trolley pole, pantograph, and outside third rail shoes for maximum flexibility. As the morning eastbound is assembled on Shafter Avenue, you can see all the seesawing activity required to place the head-in power, tack on the freight cars, and assemble a caboose and rear pusher locomotive on the end. Today's train will be headed by a 1927-built number 661 that weighed in at 137,000 pounds. Watch the somewhat crazy driving with autos pulling off last-moment squeeze-bys. This was the norm here, and SN crews had to be watchful and patient. The last move is the rear pusher and caboose, running up to the rear of the train on Shafter Avenue. The rule was to have power on both ends to avoid a train brake accident on the 4% grade ahead. This rule dated back to the beginning to satisfy Oakland City safety concerns. The arrow shows our viewing angle. Imagine an unchecked cut of cars roaring down Shafter into the small yard in this city location. Looking up Shafter, we see a westbound nearly into the terminal. Shafter had many nice homes and apartment dwellings in this view. Most people living here didn't appreciate all the activity. In this early view, you can see a more sparse housing population, and back in 1913 it was almost bare. But human nature often disregards the issue of who was there first when it comes to residential areas. Some were even concerned that these freight trains were carrying munitions. Here, a borrowed Alameda Belt Alco diesel with an OT electric picks up another train. Other customers of the formerly Key System-owned Oakland terminal had freight loads delivered to sidings branching off the Key System main lines. This 12th and Poplar customer is the old shredded wheat plant on the Key System's A line. Here we find OT's leased 442 switching empties for loads. Boxcars full of products will soon be heading to America's breakfast tables. We're back in the SN yard with number 653 leaving its train that will now wait for the OT to show up and pull it down 40th Street. After that, trailing 660 and a spoke-wheeled caboose could be put away. A last look at some of the shops at Oakland before we head for the main line out of town. Freight trains used Shafter Avenue with its steep grade that crossed College Avenue. The offset track was from early plans to possibly run a second track down the street. Engineers had to watch for poorly parked cars and prepare to stop their train. This eastbound train in Rockridge heads up the grade that was rated at 4.6%, compensated for curvature. From Shafter Avenue to Rockridge, the tracks crossed Broadway. Broadway leads to the 1937 completed Caldecott Tunnel that made auto and bus travel to Contra Costa County much easier. This was certainly one factor that killed SN's passenger service. The SN helped bring construction material to build the tunnel. An eastbound crosses Chabot Road. Chabot Elementary School is in the background. Both were named after Anthony Chabot. GE locomotive number 670 on the rear was bought in 1948 from another Western Pacific-owned traction line, the Tidewater Southern. Grinding uphill with a locomotive on each end gave good tractive effort, but added the extra cost of an engineer in both locomotives. On most railroads, a two-locomotive team-up would place both on the front. The fear of a train separation on this horrendous grade placed at least one locomotive on the rear. An eastbound train rounds the curve to head toward Lake Temescal. It has two locomotives on the point and one pushing. The tracks run along the 1869-built Lake Temescal, built by Oakland's water king, Anthony Chabot. This lake started as a reservoir, but eventually became and remains a recreation area. A good-sized train heads down grade, and watch for brake smoke. On the right of the screen is the Pacific Gas and Electric substation. When the small 40th and Shafter Yard was built in 1913, property up in Rock Ridge was bought to build a larger freight yard. Protests by homeowners over this possibility eventually forced the railroad to drop the plan, but the open field for the yard remained undeveloped to the end in 1957. A passing siding along Lake Temescal paralleled Landvale Road that became an early freeway by the 50s. This train is heading toward the Montclair district. Once in Montclair, Thornhill Road will be crossed, but first the tracks will cross over the new freeway. It's rare for trains to stop traffic on the freeway. This peculiar design was allowed with the knowledge that the SN would be torn up in a few more years. The small SN Burney streetcar on the flat car is being sent back to Yuba City. It has been preserved at the Western Railway Museum. This is the trestle that crossed Thornhill Road. The built-up embankment heads toward the shopping area in Montclair. It passes a group of homes and Montclair Elementary School on the east side, and a park built as a WPA project is on the west side. This embankment was eventually leveled. An eastbound passes by Montclair Elementary. A lot of pennies were flattened here over the years. The school still serves the community at this time. The two lead locomotives are 603 and 604. These were the only Sacramento Northern freight units that could be operated as multiple units controlled by one engineer. Notice that only the lead unit has its pantograph up. A third unit with a second engineer is pushing on the rear. The train is crossing over Mountain Boulevard. The concrete abutments survived long after the railroad was removed. A view from the old grocery store parking lot in the town of Montclair shows a train heading east on the back side of the shopping area along Mountain Boulevard. Narrow and twisty Snake Road was well named. These hills were populated with many exclusive homes. This is the small trestle over Snake Road. Behind approaching Baldwin Westinghouse locomotive number 660 is a Sacramento Northern flat car and box car. This train is heading west towards Snake Road from a location near Mellon Cut. Next will be number 661 crossing Snake Road. Back in the train is an outside brace double-door Western Pacific boxcar. .660 again on another day heading to Oakland. We'll go to Shepherd Canyon paralleling Shepherd Canyon Road. The tracks will cross into Contra Costa County using the 3,200-foot long tunnel. A pre-World War II westbound has 603 and 604 on the rear. Notice the all-black paint used before the early 50s. Orange stripes were added in the 50s for better visibility to help keep people and motorists out of harm's way. Many of these scenes show military loads that point out how the business helped keep the SN going in the Oakland Hills. Once parent Western Pacific laid tracks down Union Street in Oakland to connect to the Oakland terminal, the SN's Oakland Hills line would no longer be needed. Ironically, the WP once considered using the Sacramento Northern line as its own to save many route miles from Sacramento, but the steep grades and Shafter Avenue alignment would have been difficult to improve. Shepherd Canyon had a stop at Havens with a siding. Havens was named after a local real estate developer. We're heading east into the long tunnel. The tunnel had so many problems with water seepage and soil movement that these retaining walls were built. On the other side of the tunnel will be Eastport and the electric substation that fed the wires. The next substation was at Concord. Here's a view from the 30s with a westbound ducking into the tunnel. The crowded substation and equipment here rested on a small clearing that lacked even a siding. The tracks will parallel Pinehurst Road to Canyon Road. The block signals on the line were used as a safety plus. The SN always relied on dispatching and train orders. We head east to Redwood Canyon with its scattering of homes and a two-room schoolhouse. This area was once a supplier of redwood lumber. After that, the SN ran popular picnic trains to the area. This is watershed territory that drains into the San Leandro Reservoir. This has limited development and preserved its natural state. Past Pinehurst, where the tracks crossed Canyon Road, we'll see the auto bridge that crossed over the tracks. The train runs along the cut to Valley Vista, where a rock quarry existed in the early days. An eastbound drifts downgrade through the large pear orchard toward the small town of Moraga. Back in the 50s, it had one grocery store, a bar that was once a railroad hotel, a station, and a scattering of homes and ranches. Moraga took many decades longer than first planned to develop into a sizable community. By then, the SN itself was gone. It could have been part of the transportation picture for commuters. Moraga was just 11 miles east of Oakland. Another 8.6 miles and you could be in Walnut Creek. This could have been the nucleus of a modern commuter line. Some of the SN's first branch lines disappeared early. The one to Danville and Mount Diablo Park closed in 1924, and the Wallwood branch closed in 1920. We enter the small yard in Moraga that in the early days had a livestock corral loading facility and warehouses to handle fruit loads out of town. 606 was one of two Oakland and Antioch units built with pony trucks in addition to the 4-powered axles. These were at first used to pull fast passenger trains in the Oakland Hills. Sister unit number 605 had the pony wheels removed in the 20s and a framework change. From Moraga, trains passed by St. Mary's College through Burton, West Lafayette, Saranac, and finally Walnut Creek. This is historic 1005 pulling a Hall Scott trailer at West Lafayette over 60 years ago. When the Oakland line was abandoned on February 28, 1957, this became the westernmost point. Within a few months, Walnut Creek was the westernmost point. What remained was an all-diesel freight line isolated from the rest of the SN system. Walnut Creek and points east had many online customers. One of the good points about having a locomotive on both ends of the train through the Oakland Hills was the extra flexibility switching sidings in Walnut Creek and points east. When the SN pulled out of Oakland in 1957, the tracks were kept from Walnut Creek for several more years. In front of the Walnut Creek station was a crossover. This westbound slows in front of the Walnut Creek station, and the agent will hand up the train orders to the caboose. Here's a brief look at the station. The earliest settlers called Walnut Creek the Crossroads. A Southern Pacific branch line had an 1891 built station here in Walnut Creek. SP's tracks were crossed over by the second railroad into town, the SN's predecessor, the Oakland and Antioch. One last look at an SN freight heading west, nearly at the Walnut Creek station. Eventually, this portion of the line to Concord was sold to make way for the coming of BART trains. We'll head into the city of Concord that had a population of 6,500 in 1948. Concord had a small yard and some maintenance could be performed there. Industrial sidings brought freight revenue. Here's a look at some track work from both travel directions. This area's orchards were given up to a housing boom over the years. From Concord, trains ran timetable east through place names such as Omer, Clyde, and then Port Chicago. Port Chicago and adjacent areas became heavily industrialized. Rail service was from not only the SN but also competitors Santa Fe and SP. This area had a lot of military activity with a large naval weapons depot near the place name of Clyde on SN timetables. The Santa Fe station at Port Chicago was a place to also get Sacramento Northern tickets since the tracks were very close and parallel there. A Korean War troop train rushes by on the adjacent Santa Fe line. Sacramento Northern tracks crossed under the SP and Santa Fe tracks in what was called a subway. This subway certainly stretches the term's usage. It was built by the Oakland, Antioch, and Eastern to avoid ground-level crossovers and manning a tower. The yellow arrow indicates the location of the open-air subway. The Pittsburgh branch is to the east. The SN had a great deal of business from the Columbia Steel plant in Pittsburgh. The main line turns compass north to the ferry slips at Mallard on the Suisun Bay shore. The opposite shore is a similar slip at Chips. Our freight train run ends here at Mallard. The rail ferry Ramon was the second ferry, and it replaced the ferry Bridget that burned up in 1914. It was the only known rail ferry equipped with catenary wiring on board. The Ramon was 270 feet long and powered by a 600 horsepower distillate engine. 6 passenger or 10 freight cars could be carried at one time. A bridge across the Carquinez Strait opened to auto, bus, and truck traffic in 1927, weakening the SN's business. The bridge the SN never built could have addressed a big flaw in their system. Any bridge here needs to be high, long, and expensive to avoid disrupting shipping. The Southern Pacific ran rail ferries until 1930 when they built this lengthy bridge. The SP's Martinez to Benicia Bridge replaced its ferry in 1930. This secured SP's position as the dominant player for Sacramento to Eastbay traffic. A long freight crosses SP's bridge behind a cab-forward steam locomotive. The ferry connection made the SN's freight and passenger service a little less competitive. When the SP and SN both used ferries, the SN was on an even playing field for Sacramento to Oakland passenger business. The SN had the additional expense of crewing, maintaining, and operating the ferry Ramon to link the two halves of its south end system. It added to the railroad's charm, but not to the bottom line. On August 8, 1954, the Ramon was sold for $5,000 and the slips were shut down. The isolated portion of the SN was linked to Sacramento by trackage rights over the Santa Fe. As the Meteor, westbound train number 3, runs into Concord in the late 30s, we can reflect on a once fine electric system. You have seen 3 historic electric lines that served the Bay Area. The SN lasted the longest by relying on freight. Nothing like it will ever exist again.
This DVD also brings the Southern Pacific Red Trains of the Eastbay area and the Peninsular Railway, with much more history and beautiful historic scenes. Look for it on our website, and thanks for watching.